so many people.
If you look at me and talk, this owl actually like tracks who's talking. And so it's almost like eye contact. Or if you want to look directly at the camera, then you just look at the little owl eyes.
But Laura, to see the slides,
Yes.
we have to look at
But
the
it will-
slides.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it will,
So I'm going to share my screen to
Okay.
start here.
Okay.
Screen share. All right. Can folks see the screen that are on the video?
Yep, we can.
Right. All right. We're going to get started here. We anticipate probably a few folks will be calling in and rolling in as we get going. But without further ado, thank you for joining. This is a Women in Design event. So the Professional Development Committee is putting on a series called Advocate. The idea is to talk about different ways that you can advocate for yourself within the workplace and for your community. So today's session is about advocating for the community, and we have Ann Beha and Natasha Espada here who are going to start out and talk about a project that they're working on together, and then have a little bit of a conversation around that. So that's a very short order summary.
and we can also talk about how you ended up doing this, right? Because of the AIA New York and
yeah.
DSA group. Maybe that's something that
Yeah,
wanna
there
start
was
with
a
that?
there was a series that was being put on by AIA New York that you guys spoke at that was on a slightly different topic. Genevieve Frank, who's the co-chair of Women in Design, is on the call virtually, and she got to see that panel in New York. And she came back and said, we got to do this. This fits in so perfectly with the theme for the year, and we should invite them to come and do a presentation with us. So we've spent a couple of months having a conversation around what that looks like, and hopefully it's going to lead to a good discussion today. And we'll open it up for Q&A with people who are on the phone as well as we move forward. So
I was
definitely.
going to say, Anna and Tasha just stole the show in New York. So really excited to continue the conversation here.
They gave us this topic, which was the post-COVID practice, right?
and we
got
turned it
down
into
there,
something else.
and it turned out COVID wasn't over. So the whole premise of the presentation needed to be reconstructed. So we kind of went rogue.
We did,
Yeah.
but then we had such a good reviews that they asked us to do it in Boston now.
Yeah.
And actually talk about advocacy and collaborations and community.
That's right. And what we ended up talking about was how we had worked together during COVID, but also how we had engaged with community, despite the fact that it was hard to be with them, which is a very difficult distancing that has had to occur. And I think will be part of continuing interface. I mean, for example, when we talk about the project, Natasha, I don't think we had one regulatory meeting on the EVA project where we were able to be with people.
Correct. It
And
was
that-
all on Zoom.
Yeah, and that building of trust that goes on when you are able to be with people and can see them, personally, it doesn't happen when you're switching screens.
And we've only seen Maida and Vanessa, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the CEO, the executive director, and the COO of EVA. I've only met them in person 3 times. Once I went to give a talk to the students, to all of the youth in this Puerto Rican community. The second one was we took materials so we could look at them in person and on the
Finished
site
boards.
Yeah.
and finished boards. But beyond that, we saw them every week for, I don't know, a year on Zoom every Tuesday morning.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think we've all had that experience now of life with people, but then also life really with screens, and it's part of navigating them. So it's just part of where we are. Okay, so Laura, we should stick to the script. Sorry.
All good.
And Natasha and I have been working on this slideshow, and thank you, Natasha, for all your hard work on it. And I start by talking about the firm that was Ann Beha Architects. That's the firm that started the work with Natasha's firm for the EVA project, this extraordinary opportunity to combine advocacy with design excellence. But it is now Annam Architects, and some of Annam's great young leaders are here today. And I'm just so proud to know that the dream I had about starting a firm is now something that you all are standing on my shoulders doing. Annam does have a strong commitment to advocacy. Many of the members of the firm are on local boards, local neighborhood groups, various kinds of regulatory groups in their own communities. And we also have undertaken a number of pro bono projects in the last couple of years through the Community Preservation Act, which tends to be specific projects that don't have an architect involved and need someone to provide services. And I think Hannah, you've probably been on them. And Hannah is also our NOMA representative on the university level. And there's an advocacy task force at ANAM that is active, and well, if it isn't, it's time to get active. But it deals with a number of things: sustainability, well-being, et cetera. So it's a dialogue that occurs in the practice. I think even more so now that you're probably back at the office and at their new office at 40 Broad Street, which is pretty cool. So our work has been largely the kind of integration of contemporary architecture in historic settings, reinterpretation of historic sites, and trying, as I think, essentially to make historic sites that may have had a certain association more available and inviting and accessible to a broader audience, whether it's a museum or university building or community building, trying to make even very solid historic buildings more transparent, more inviting, and more inclusive. So I pass it to Natasha.
So Anne, Anne has always been a mentor, even if she didn't know it. And we didn't know each other as well until a couple of years ago when I was BSA president in 2020. I saw her attend a lot of things but I've always admired her work. And I have a different path than Anne. I was at Lear's Weinsappel for 20 years, loved every minute of it, learned a ton, very close to all of them. And then one day I decided that I wanted to try something different. So I started Studio NA Architects. We say we're a diverse firm, designing projects at every scale. And we're a women and minority firm. I'm Puerto Rican. And I've lived in Boston for 30 years. So that's how I know Untitled Architects, because she has quite the legacy here in Boston. But we do a lot of different types of projects. We do civic, cultural, higher education. We do commercial and life science right now. And we do a lot of projects for underrepresented communities. And another thing that we do is we do a lot of collaborations, such as the one that we're doing with Anne. About 35% of our work are collaborations and all different sizes and types of projects. Sometimes we're the prime architect and sometimes we are the collaborating architect. And so I was trying to create a new model of practice. And so that's what we've been doing. So the next slide shows who we are. We're super diverse. 70% of us are women. There are a couple of people that are some of the students that aren't here. But we're represented by not only the US, but also Puerto Rico, we're represented by Taiwan, Ethiopia, Vietnam, and it keeps on going. So I'm very proud of that because I've been working with the BSA, and that's the next slide, on advocacy through the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Justice Task Force that we put together in 2018, plus all my work for women in design since 1995. And I've been talking about creating a diverse practice, and it's difficult to make a diverse practice when there isn't a lot of diverse architects. So there is something to be said for all the people in Anne's firm here and the people from my firm that show a lot of diversity in a part of the country where there aren't as many diverse architects as we would like in the pool. So we not only do it, and I not only do it through the BSA, but also on our projects where we've been working with Ibram X. Kendi on the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. I also with Janelle Danhill from Perkins and Will. I'm a collaborator with Resiliency Puerto Rico, helping Puerto Rico during difficult times, including what's just happening right now. Hopefully we will be able to do some work there to help. And then in my community in Needham, so I'm part of Needham United Against Racism, and I'm on the planning board. I'm the co-chair of Affordable Housing and the Climate Action Plan Group. And so the BSA, I have to say, is what taught, well, people like Anne and Andrea Lears and Jane White-Sappel and all these other mentors that I've had in my life, it taught me about advocacy, but it wasn't until I really started working with the BSA on the EDI plus H and then became social justice that really introduced me to how we can make impact. And so it kind of changed my life.
And somehow you still find time to like sleep and eat and stuff.
She slept as a child.
Yeah. So, okay, so the next one. So you wanted us to talk about this particular project. And one of the things that I was telling the group here before everyone came in is that Anne and I, there were about 12 architects that they had looked at to work on this project. And Anne and I were two of the architecture firms. And because of my visibility at the BSA and visibility in general, we reached out to each other to see if we wanted to do it together, because we thought that together we would be a stronger team. And we ended up winning the project, and we ended up winning over a Puerto Rican firm. So another
But
Puerto
I,
Rican firm.
and I also want to add to that, you know, over the years in our office, we've had many, many collaborations, and 6 collaborations alone with Gensler and then with many other leading firms. But on this project, when the RFP came in, I went to Phil Chen, who's president of ANAM, and said, I don't think we have the cultural association with this group that's going to make this building really special. I think we can design this building. I think we have the credentials to build it in Boston, but we don't have the cultural association, or I guess that's a phrase. I don't know if it's the best phrase, but the kind of alignment of cultural values. It's not that we didn't want them, and it's not that I hadn't been to Puerto Rico several times with Beatriz, but it just seemed like the alignment and integration of their voice was going to be critical to the job. And that's when Phil said, and that's why you have partners, you know, because you want to take them the information at times when you're feeling great about things, and you also want to say, I think we need something. What do you think? And he said, you should call Natasha. So, and that was really great advice.
And in this case, so all these different partnerships that we do are all completely different. And so some of them are where we are collaborating on a specific piece of a project. Some of them are, there are several buildings on the site and we're doing one of the buildings. In this particular one, we were working on one building together. And I also wanted to be respectful to Anne in that they do a lot of cultural projects. We do a lot of cultural projects. She has a lot of experience. You were on the Landmarks Commission at one point. You have a lot of experience in Boston with historic and historic district. And so we wanted to make sure that we wanted to make sure that it was a 50-50 piece. So I thought, and she was gracious enough. I said to her, and this is, you know, for my community, I'd like to be prime. This is an opportunity for my firm to grow. And she said, I completely agree. I said, but we will do it 50-50, but this is an opportunity for me to be prime on this one. And you're collaborating, but really and it's worked that way the entire
Well,
time.
I have never, personally, I would say I've never regretted that decision. I think it's absolutely appropriate. And Natasha, you've been every inch the leader throughout the whole thing. So, but one of my favorite things you said when you, one time we were saying, well, you know, how do we decide who's going to decide the design, you know, like, but there are 5 ideas, whose idea gets to win, you know, and you said, best idea always wins.
And has it worked that way?
Yes,
So far?
it's really something that stayed with me. I thought it was brilliant insight, and it was absolutely right. It has a kind of, there's a kind of refreshing clarity about that we are all there to get the best idea, not necessarily our idea. And I think it has, I appreciate it very much. And Steve Gerard has been the partner in charge for Anna. I'll talk a little bit later about what I'm doing now, but he's really leading the charge with Hannah, Rita. And who else? Is there anybody else here who's working on it? Okay, but the team will grow. So bravo. And Hannah's first experience with major regulatory submittals. So we're doing well. Okay.
And from our team, I want to say Michael Schombacher is the project manager, and he's been doing an amazing job. And Daniela Stayback Rodriguez, that we worked on Resiliency. That's how we met. And in projects in Puerto Rico, she's the project architect from our firm. So it's been a great team, and we really work as one team.
Yeah. Let's keep going because we'll find it. Do you want to speak about EVA's mission or?
Sure, I'll just go through a couple of slides
please.
about EVA. So EVA's mission was to empower and engage individuals and families to improve their lives through high quality, affordable housing, education, and arts program. And
they're 40 years old.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important part of it. They have a legacy in Boston of having constructed housing at times when housing was very, very, well, I would say racially charged issue, and of building quality housing that has remained part of the South End. So I've been very impressed with their portfolio, with their accomplishments.
And they actually, in the 1960s, they went to the BPDA. They didn't want their whole area destroyed with what is it called, urban renewal. And so basically what they did is that they created EVA, And so the next slide shows all the different components of what EVA does, which is affordable housing, youth development, a preschool, resident services, because they have the 667 units. And then the arts is a big part of it. So all of these pieces are all scattered throughout, and maybe it's in the next slide, through this whole area of the Villa Victoria community, which is a big area. It's a little pixelated, but it's a big area in the south end of Boston. And so a lot of housing and some, public buildings as well. And so this is the community in the area that they're in.
And we showed these slides to people when we were starting the project because the EVA organization wasn't really well understood by everyone. And the first premise is, well, somebody wants to build a building. Who are these, who are these proponents? What are they all about? And I think you were so right to include that slide that showed what they did. Even though that's not about the design, we didn't want to let that go unmentioned when we showed the design, because people should invest in the entire project, not just in the facade and whether the facade fits in the neighborhood. They should, they should want and respect the entire package, really.
And so the next slide shows the specific site. And we're really lucky because the site is adjacent to the O'Day Playground. And it's on West Newton Street and Tremont Street, for those of you that know Boston. And basically, it's surrounded by EVA housing. So there are townhouses, smaller townhouses on the east side of the site, and then on the other side of West Newton Street, more the brownstones. But the fact that the site, and Ann's going to talk more about the site in 1 second, the fact that the site is so close to Tremont Street and has this amazing park next to it was a huge benefit to the community.
So it was really easy to fall in love with EVA. All you had to do was to meet Vanessa and Myra and some of the people in their community. And I like, hey, I want to build this building. This has got to happen. So when you asked us about advocacy, I think the first thing that advocacy is based on is at least a passion for the purpose. And so Natasha and all of us and Hannah and Steve and the whole team put together what we thought the kind of guiding principles would be. And without getting into each one of them, we presented this again and again to people. And I think that a good neighbor and contributor to the district and an expression of Latinx culture, those were probably two of the things that were complicated in terms of what people believed and then could happen. And then also the idea of progressive architecture in one of the oldest historic districts in the city was another thing that it was kind of like a scientific idea. You have to prove it. Mm-hmm. You're stating this is our goals, but how does the rubber hit the road? So let's go to the next and say that we then organized early on a sense of what they were about so that we could distill their entire purpose or their mission into this sort of little planetary system, and everybody could understand. They're about community, and the things they need and the things they do in that community can be summed up in just these in this bubble diagram. There's always a missing piece, and I was saying I should put in a bubble for other, because they do innovative things that you can't predict today. And in designing a building for a community that's constantly changing and doing more, that other is what you're really providing them, is that kind of nimble ability to do something they hadn't even thought about at the time of the program.
Right. And one critical piece is in the mission, it said, in the vision, it said transparency. They were, and you'll see in a second, they were in a beautiful church.
We can go to it.
Yeah, we can go.
Oh,
well,
sorry. No,
let's go. But this is part of the transparency, was that this building is not just a regular cultural building. It's a building for the Puerto Rican diaspora here in Boston, which is very specific to this project. It's not a building in Puerto Rico. It's a building for the Puerto Rican community here that's been established here for a very long time. And so we had to keep that in mind for many reasons, and we'll show you in a second. So one of the first things that we did is the next slide, which is showing Puerto Rican architecture. On the left-hand side, it's pictures of El San Juan, the vibrancy of the colors, but that is the Puerto Rican, that is in Puerto Rico. And then on the right-hand side is also the legacy of modern architecture in Puerto Rico, with the screening and kind of a more refined glass and daylight and all of that. And so we brought this to the attention of the community, and they felt like we were listening to them and that this is something that they were interested in. But then we also had to marry that with being in the South End, in the historic kind of Victorian neighborhood of Boston. So that was interesting to be able to try to put the two together, and how do we do that? And that was one of the challenges.
I think that
Complicated set of
I was really so thrilled that you did this, because I think we otherwise would have just been dealing only with the idea of the American legacy in the South End. Now, of course, the South End was a very diverse immigrant community from its earliest days, probably the most diverse in that part of the city. But in order to really represent them, Natasha, I think this was essential, because we needed to show that there is another story to the story, and that both sides of that needed to come together around a building that could do both.
I see some new people came in. Maybe, does everyone want to sit over here? I feel badly, we're giving you our backs. And so
There is also like pizza and seltzer. Please get up, help yourself. Don't feel overly formal.
I just don't feel, yeah, I feel like you can move to this side because we're facing in this direction.
We're trying to face the camera so that we're not like weirdly in profile. the whole
Thank
time.
you.
Okay.
Okay,
So we'll go to the next, and then, so this is a similar kind of, one of a series of diagrams or clusters of images to speak to the community. And when we say the community, there probably are more than two handfuls of community groups in the South End that have an interest in this project. But to talk to them also about placing or expressing that heritage of Puerto Rico somehow in a community that isn't about that, has been about other things, has had different kinds of expressions. So finding its voice in the South End.
and so the Puerto Rican community has had to code switch to basically integrate itself into this community. So this is an opportunity for this new building to be the new manifestation of this community in this day and age.
And kind of harmonizing of those different objectives for different dynamics.
And added to this, and another issue for advocacy is, and I'll come to it later again, but is the knowledge of what preceded all this. So when you show people something new and you're in a historic district and you say, I'm asking you to consider something you didn't expect, because that's essentially what you're doing. You need to know that you're new to the community and there's background. So in order to be a spokesperson or even part of a spokesperson team, you better know what the background is. We didn't know the background, not very well. And the background was that for many, many years, this community had had all of its arts and culture programs in an historic church. The historic church had been deemed structurally unstable, and against a great deal of commentary and opposition, IBA had demolished it. So in going into this moment of advocacy for something new and saying, hi, we're the architects here to show you something new, and we want to marry a Puerto Rican legacy with the South End. Everyone was like, yeah, but what about what happened? We're like,
And yeah, and
Yeah.
and they also thought that they had taken it down because they didn't want to fix it. What had happened is they never had the money to do anything to the building. They had only painted the inside of the building. When they finally started restoring and repointing the brick, that's when the structural analysis came in and they realized that the building was not able, was not structurally viable, and ISD shut it down. So, but the community felt that they just didn't want to invest in the building, and that was not necessarily true.
I think it's a complex layering, but one of the things I'll just say for me personally was that my thesis at MIT in 1975 was on the potential and underused value of ecclesiastical buildings. So I heard this history, and to me, it just brought up all of the first 7 or 8 years of work I'd done to try to advocate that people who owned these extraordinary 19th century landmarks, whether it was in Brooklyn or Cambridge or Boston or wherever, would try to find new uses for them that could sustain them architecturally, but give new life to them. In the end of the day, those kinds of buildings have an association with their prior owner. It's very difficult to secularize some kinds of buildings. And they're also characterized typically by monumental masonry construction, the exact opposite of transparency. If it's sort of, if you don't belong there, how would you know what was going on? Even if there was a welcoming person at the door, stepping over that threshold is complicated. So throughout the US, these kinds of buildings have been very much chess pieces in terms of communities supporting them, new users not being able to maintain them. And they continue today under an advocacy group in Philadelphia called Partners for Sacred Places as among the most threatened typologies. And it just isn't surprising that at some point their construction methods, which were never as good as people think they were, their construction methods or their conditions, or even the legacy of disuse that a prior owner may have had for them, catch up with them. And they become extraordinary, expensive, monumental restoration projects. So I think I can really see this, but what we're saying is that no matter what you're working on, there was something there before you. There's always a context. And if you're going to be able to be effective as a teammate with a new initiative, you have to know the emotion, the attachment, and the history of things that preceded. Is that fair to say? And while
That
we
is
didn't
fair.
get into it because we weren't part of it, we were feeling it,
So-
certainly in the meetings. We understood that there was still a lot of feeling.
By the time we were hired to work on the project, the church did not exist. And we'll show you a slide of what the site looks like today. But I agree with you. But this was a really interesting uncovering that I
So
think.
our team at ABA did some work also on what else had been on the block. So you see the parish house to the far left of this slide. That's the edge of the former church. And then next to it was the first girls' high school in Boston that then relocated, it's Girls Latin. And it's a monumental building. This was not a building of a street of small townhouses or, South End residences. This was, as the South End is, a kind of distribution of larger scale buildings with smaller scale kind of vernacular housing.
And we wanted the community to see this because the community only remembered the church, right? So they didn't remember that there were larger buildings that were public and civic buildings that were on that street as well.
And I don't know if it really mattered to the community or if it does. I mean, I want to respect that they.
But don't you
they
think for
would look at it.
scale?
But I think what was so important was just knowing it and doing our homework so that when we could talk about advocating for something new, we could say it bears a relationship to something that was,
But I think landmarks appreciated that
Yeah,
also
I hope
because
so.
it gave
I think
the
so.
layers and then it gave the scale to
Yeah.
the neighborhood.
Well put. So lots and lots of meetings, and these are just a summary of the kinds of environments in which architects are essentially advocating for their buildings. We're never alone, but there is a lot of focus on the architect in those settings. And there are comments and there are unusual people sometimes making comments or unusual comments. All of it is kind of this, suddenly you've got your catcher's mitts up and you're hearing a lot of things and you're processing it and what's going through your head is, this is never going to fly. We're going to die here. This can never get approved. But somehow I think there's a navigational system through all this. And I think what's so important is to identify some community members, some advocates who are willing to go the course with you. Because as an architect, they know you're here today, you don't live there, and you won't be there after the building is open. It's unlikely that you'll be there. So, the credibility of having community members who support the project, I think is quite important. It doesn't matter what community you're in. This is all, this is national and international, frankly.
And in general, we had a really positive feedback from the community.
Yes.
They were very, very supportive, but this was also happening in a year of an election. And so the regulatory groups, people were changing and things were happening. So when you advocate, you need to keep the consistency amongst all the different people that are coming in and out of projects to be able to tell the story, but also to be able to make sure that the project that the client that you've been working with the client gets represented in the best way possible to continue to move that process forward in a collaborative way. So
So let's keep going and show you what we were dealing with. These are the buildings that face the site. The site is the O'Day Playground, as Natasha said. It had that large monumental school on it until the sort of middle part of the 20th century. It had the monumental church. So it was a context on the one hand, the right hand being the sort of typical 5-story South End townhouses, and on the other hand, a memory of what had been there, and open space and an empty lot.
And I think it's the next slide.
Yeah, so this is the view from Tremont Street. And you see here that there's a very small building after the front on Tremont Street, and the site is just behind those trees.
So right now, it's not occupied. And the next one shows the rubble, basically. of
And
what's
this
left.
is also something one is dealing with as an architect, is the idea that there is betterment to come with an approval for a building. But at the moment, there's a situation which is not ideal in a neighborhood.
But look at the location. I mean, from here, you could see the Prudential building, you could see the Hancock building. It's right at the edge of the South End and the Back Bay. And not only that, there's also a difference of scales there. On Tremont, you see there are 4-story townhouses or 5-story townhouses. But on the right-hand side, next to the site, are these really small kind of townhouses that are also owned by EBA. So being sensitive to the interior of the site, being sensitive to the street and to the overall context was really important. And I think that's what the next slides are going to show.
So we first started with some general massing for the site, looking at how the program would be accommodated. And I think we should keep moving through these. And over the months, then the actual site plan, which has many other parameters around city alleys and setbacks and expectations and the park and all these other scalar and legal issues.
Well, one thing I do want to add about this, Ann, is that you can see the dotted line is where the old church was. The red is where the new building is located, and the site only extends to the light gray. But one of the things that something that was set on the site basically was this multi-purpose room, this cultural room that was fairly large for 300 people or so. And where was this going to be located on the footprint that we had? And then what would that do for the rest of the program of the building?
So this is, you're absolutely right. This is with the All Saints Church footprint overlay. And again, Natasha, I think it was such a great idea because it connected the past, it acknowledged the past. It said, yes, you had something here and this is its footprint and this is how it relates to the future. And it was so important to scale that out.
And to pull it in, one of the things that the community or the regulatory groups wanted was us to pull it in away from where it says Villa Victoria housing on the top. So as you can see, the church used to go right to the edge of the property line, but we pulled it back. We made it closer to the edge to create a better street edge. And then we also set it back a little bit from the park, but then the park has its own amphitheater and it faces the building. So we had all of these context and site and context issues that we were trying to navigate that helped us shape the building. So that the next one is more of a floor plan, and these are a little pixelated, but it's the multi-purpose room on the first level and a lobby, but most of the spaces are like, there's lower level support programs, but the next plan shows that the upper levels has office spaces and a gallery and a roof deck. And you'll see it in 3D in a second.
And community meeting rooms.
And community meetings.
So that, essentially this is a workspace for community services. So privacy is important and offices do need to be made. But the number of gathering and community and breakout spaces here is in good balance to that. And that's so that people can come together. And so another piece about this in terms of purpose was you've talked a little bit about building this for the community that EBA represents, but EBA also welcomes and has welcomed for all those years in the church building, the entire community, all community members. So if you look, what we did is looked also at the number of community buildings that were in the South End. We said, you don't really have a lot of buildings in the South End where people can gather. You have
Right.
churches, that's rather privatized. You have a public library, it's not big. Where's the common ground? And that I think is important, that the playground is common ground, and where the blue is the big community room is also common ground that is framed by the playground and floats into it.
If we go to the next one, it shows, and then,
So
yeah, this is the big,
the leap.
yeah. you want me to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
So we're in a neighborhood where we have this kind of cultural building, and the entire neighborhood is brick. It's masonry and metal, I guess, on the upper levels. And so we were trying to think, we wanted this to be a modern, vibrant building. We wanted to use a material that was complementary to what was there, but that it defined it as a building, and we wanted to have transparency. And so we looked at using terracotta. We had used terracotta, and so has Anne's office. And so we basically looked at a way of creating a modern version of the Victorian neighborhood. And if you go to the next slide, we looked at different shapes of terracotta. And here on the right-hand side is the way we're using it. We'll show you some images right now, but we used it in a way that allowed for the building to feel light and airy, to bring color, and to be complementary to the buildings around in the same scale as the levels of the buildings around, and but in a different and a modern way. And that is not as easy to, it's not as easy to do in Boston as it is, especially in historic districts, as it is in other modern cities in the United States. So I don't know if you want to add anything.
No,
to the
let's just,
terracotta.
I think that these are studies that I think helped get the conversation going. And what you can see at the top is a very light colored representation of the facade on West Newton Street. And the opposite hand are the townhouses across the street. So they are scaled. You'll see another slide in a minute where there's definitely register lines that come off at the townhouses that try to find their voice in these facades, and then pulled back sections that are larger windows. And the base of it, we wanted to have be very transparent. And then because the South End has very strong feelings about the way buildings terminate, over the series of meetings with the South End Landmarks Commission, we started to pull the parapet into a more prominent position so that it was expressed as a building top. And of course, it hides mechanical systems, but it is really trying to express this kind of continuity of the gray slate dormer systems that run throughout the housing in the South End. And it was very much something that the community cared about.
And as Anne mentioned, the first floor is glazed. It's the lobby. It was important to have a lobby where you could have cocktail hours. It could be a gallery. It could have multi-purpose. But then on the right-hand side, right next to it, in the corner is a stair that leads you to the second level, which is a small gallery, and also a classroom space for our art students, for kids, really. But then the upper two levels are office space. And one is for resident services, the other one are the EBA offices. So you had a building that had a public face to it, and then it had a private, semi-private public, because you have the public going up to talk about resident services, but it needed to be very sensitive. It's very sensitive information. So we had to figure out how to put the program pieces in the right place. And so in the next slide.
We should keep going because we're going to have some time. But these are, I'm just continuing what Natasha's saying, is that
Yeah.
this is a classic ABA kind of study that is about comparing an existing fabric of a city with something new and trying to find the voice between the two, the relationship between the two.
Yeah.
So we could go on and on
We
about
can-
how the alignments work.
And so
But,
these are
yeah.
some views for,
Go ahead.
these were some views from the street. And how does it really, again, the girls' school being kind of a precedent for a larger building on this block with the park. And this is right on West Newton Street as you're coming from Tremont Street. The next one is looking at it from West Newton towards Tremont Street and the Back Bay. And so what we did is we created the multi-purpose room, being a double height space, is in the interior of the block, and it's glazed so that it would become the backdrop at the city level for anything happening in the park. But then it also has doors that open up, large doors that open up so that you can actually extend whatever's happening in the room out towards it. And so on the left-hand side is the 4-story building. On the right-hand side is the 2-story building, and where you see the people standing, that is the roof deck that we've created to have another location for the community to gather. And this is a view again from the O'Day Park, looking towards the multi-purpose room. Again, looking at the scale, bringing down the scale of that 2-story height to be next to the townhouses. And then this is the bird's eye view, looking at the opportunity also of having public art. And there are a lot of rules about public art being in specific places. We were able to put it so that these houses here wouldn't be looking at a brick wall. That's an opportunity for art that it then again is an opportunity at the larger scale for the park and for the community. And Angie, you want to talk about?
These are interior views that Steve and Hannah worked on for the multi-purpose room. And I think Natasha's office was a great collaborator with us on determining out of several different options, which one seemed like the best. And then we took them to EBA and overlaid them with the technical requirements for theater and dance and flexibility in this room. So it can be everything from parties to theater performance. It's a very simple room. You know, we're working with a very, very tight budget. So the main thing we're creating here is a setting where people can gather and kind of make the space into what they want. And it looks out at the park, and I think that's its big moment.
There's another view.
And then it extends it. We have extended seating that collapses into the wall, and a lot of flexibility about how this pours out into the park. Let me just say it's a two-handed relationship, because the park also comes into it. And I think that was very important to the community, that this is not just about kind of EBA moving out there, but also about people being invited.
And one of the great things that we were able to do was during our meetings with the city, we were able to include the Parks Department. And they're actually making it a priority to renovate this park in the near future so that it could be a partner. We brought them in so they could see what we were doing, so that their new work would actually be in partnership with whatever was happening here. And as Anne mentioned, you know, we work together on every aspect of the project, but someone needs to draw a part of the project and someone needs to, you know, take the lead on it. So we worked on the exterior, and Anne and her group worked more on the interior, but again, we all worked on everything together. It was just that as we divide up the work to create documents.
I mean, we can talk more about those collaboration moments. I wanted to say about the Parks Department that Natasha, I think it was very important that we had a member of the South End community who had been involved in advocating for the O'Day playground for a long time. And luckily, Eva knew her. She came to some of the community meetings. And when I heard her start to talk about the O'Day playground and what was in mind, I'm like, I want her at every meeting, you know, because she wasn't going to let it go. She had been given time as a community member to taking the park department at their word and saying, you're going to make this a priority. So that it's very important to have, again, that community of people who are willing to come with you and say
and advocate for good
This is a good
design and
thing.
advocate for good
Yeah.
projects. And similarly, there was someone at the BPDA who was reviewing our project who had been at Landmarks. And so we were able to get Landmarks and BPDA to talk to us together at times so that we knew how they both felt about the project, and we were working as a team rather than individually in silos. And I thought that was really helpful.
it was helpful, but I would like to say it didn't come without advocacy, because it wasn't the normal way of doing things.
Mhm.
It wasn't the normal way of doing things to have a community member join us for those meetings so that she could say to the Parks Department, this is just what I think you had in mind, isn't it? And I think this is really good. So that, you know, and a lot of what we did was say, how can we make this relationship stronger and get people in the room who are willing to talk to each other? Otherwise, you do deal with a lot of individual agendas, and that can be challenging after a while. So just the last image is one also from Steve, looking at the legacy of the church. They do have things that they've saved from the church, and the community has asked, and as have regulatory groups, that they be somewhere installed. So in some meeting rooms in the church, there will be some stained glass windows displayed, hopefully, and that's been an important piece to people who remember the history of the site.
And they also want us to do some type of exhibit or
Yes.
some type, a panel that says, this is what was on the site before, and this is the history of the site, versus just kind of forgetting this legacy that was really important in this part of Boston.
That's a lovely shot at night. Thank you. And I think it's true. So I just think it was great to have that. And you have to have a night shop because after all, in Boston, that's 4 o'clock in February. It's just, you want to make sure that the streetscape is enhanced by the building. And that, well, somebody who's had an office in downtown Boston for 40 years, you can walk around in Boston at night and it's dark. And so the idea that this is luminous and inviting
And a
is
beacon for the
very
community.
important
Yeah.
in that community, very important. So I did a little thinking with Natasha and came up with this kind of hit list of advocacy. So Laura, I'm going to turn this back over to you, but I made this list and thank you, Natasha, for putting it into a legible, getting beyond my blue beam skills. And I
Danielle.
thought, well, what does it take to think about advocacy? And I thought first, a purpose. You have to say, there's something I believe in here. Secondly, the premise that if it happened, this would be the outcome. So just right away with Eva, you can say, first of all, there's a real purpose to that organization. Secondly, if they got a new building, the outcome would be really, I think, really elevating for the South End, for the community, and for a city that has never grappled well with many of the issues that Eva represents and has tried to advance. So premise and the process. So in terms of the process of doing a project like this, even though it's a small project under BPDA, is pretty hair-raising when you consider the list of all the entities who need to say they'll consider it and that maybe even they'll approve it. That's a good day.
Right.
So what did I think after doing these kinds of projects for a long time? What do I think is needed? And it's just interesting for me to go through my head on it. I thought, well, first, you got to be prepared. If you want something to happen and you haven't done that research and you don't know what was there and you haven't looked into it, and you don't know the people and you haven't looked at the board, you're just going to be another kind of gun for hire. I hate to use that phrase, but it is used about architects. We go in and we're incredibly insensitive to these things because we just didn't do our homework, and that's very weak. So knowledge and research based, I think, is important. Secondly, navigation. The number of conversations that you and I had about who needed to be in the room for things, and Natasha and Myra also, who needed to be in the room for things, when the community should be at meetings, when they should not, when certain other advocates should be in the meetings. We talked about that a lot.
And we also talked about in general, how do we represent the client
Yeah.
in an equitable way?
Yes.
Because we don't want people taking cultural appropriation on the Puerto Rican community here because they think they know best. And so that was really critical to make sure that we stood up for them and said it, via architecture, which is a language that they don't necessarily speak, right? And so we felt this incredible responsibility for this building, which will probably be one of the most important buildings that they will build in this community, because they have a lot of important housing, but that's already built. And so as a new building, I felt like we were the conduit for them to bridge with the city and make sure that they were being treated fairly.
So the third thing, I'm really glad you said that. The third thing I felt was that it should be actionable. And it's one thing to talk about, well, we should do this, we should do that. But in the end of the day, I'm a list maker. I make lists. I mean, look at this. This is so obnoxious. I mean, I got CVS books. I put CVS in the stock exchange, I swear, because I just make lists of everything. I have to do this. I have to do that. But it has to be actionable. It has to get done. And sometimes it's a professional needs to do it. Sometimes it's a volunteer that needs to help. And sometimes there's coaching needed in order to do it. So in order to make a presentation, you don't just go without somebody saying, okay, you did a run through and here's what I suggest. So I think renewal of the idea. So being very consistent about our message, being very determined but respectful about it. Diplomacy plays a big role, but the renewing of maybe there's something else like repetition till the Pyrrhic victory, the enemy is dead because they just, they're ready to give up because you've just worn them down. I don't think that's a good way to do it, but renewing the message is important. And then I think your own identity. I think that credibility, because you are Puerto Rican, that credibility was really important. And because our firm had done a great deal of work with historic districts and done them with what I think was integrity, we had opportunity to speak in ways that were extremely effective, and to listen also, because we knew that listening was as important as speaking. And then finally, impact. Well, I don't know whether this is the best word for it, but we wanted to look along the way of, are we making progress on this? Are we getting where we need to go? Are we able to hear the community and get their best ideas into the design? It's not about overcoming the community. It's about respecting and getting their thoughts and allowing those thoughts to impact the project in positive ways.
And not only just from one group in the community, but from all groups in the community, including the youth. So I went in
Yeah.
one day to talk to the youth to say, I'm Puerto Rican, just like you. And I had a path that led me to architecture because I had people that supported me in that way. And this is something that you can do, and this is what I do. And so I think understanding and showing them the project and saying, and this is what this project's going to be, and so that you can learn about architecture and engineering and all of these things. So including the community and at different levels, including hopefully looking for contractors that are diverse, that bring the community in as well at all levels, was really important to the project.
And then everything else, the big question always is what's going to happen that we didn't predict? And how do we remain nimble? We're currently in a regulatory process, and that will take a while. So we don't really know what will happen to the project through that. We're optimistic.
Well, also the construction industry, as all of you know here,
Yeah.
has been very volatile. And so there's the supply chains and there's COVID and there aren't enough contractors right now to do the work. So all of those pieces, we're looking at all these challenges and taking them as opportunities and always brainstorming about how do we keep the project going in the right direction. And so I think
Let's talk about fundraising for a minute. Just this week, what came up for EBA, it's come up for many, many projects we've been involved in because ABA worked 99% for nonprofits, is fundraising. So we were asked to consult with their fundraising group about where we might get philanthropy for the project. That's also part of advocacy, and it goes right back to the beginning. If you want it built, you're going to listen to those issues about how do we get it built. And Natasha did a great job by showing them some videos that clients had made for other projects. We've certainly seen that too. Professional renderings that they could use. Various things we thought were important points to make about the project and going to foundations, and some weak things, some things we thought hadn't yet been fully thought through that we were concerned that foundations would be concerned about. So that was something that isn't really on this list, but asking an architect to think outside of its normal profession to say, well, we want to get this building built. You want to get this building built. What can you give us to reach to things that we need to do that aren't what you were trained to do? And I think fundraising has been part of nearly every project we've ever done. And being willing to go in with an owner to advocate or show the project has been very important. And one of the things I think is most important about that is that it's the entire project that you're fundraising for. You're not fundraising for a building. You're fundraising for the people who will elevate their lives by being in that building. And
just
that's the story of the building for me. It's not there just to be a building. You can find plenty of projects where people are just funding the building. At EBA and in so many of our projects, they're funding the whole generation of people whose lives are mixed into a facility that can advance them.
And it's not just funding the building, but it's also funding the maintenance
And
for the
operations.
ongoing operation of the building. But what I find inspiring, I guess, of the fundraising piece is that you start brainstorming about things that may have opportunities for the project.
That's
Like,
right.
are there ways to get grants to make the project more sustainable?
That's
Are
right.
there ways to get grants to be able to give visibility in different ways, right? So how do you brainstorm and become part of their team to see the project completed, not just for the architecture, but for kind of the future vision of it and the opportunities for sustainability and equity and all of these things that sometimes when you're going so fast could fall through the cracks. So this kind of gives us a check that the people that want to fund this project care about other humanitarian pieces about the project or other initiatives that we need to take into account that will only make the project better if we can find funding for it.
Now, this project has a very high social impact and social purpose, and all of us have diverse practices. And in some cases, we're not working on projects that have that kind of fundamental human services component. But I can't tell you the number of times when you get debrief about why you got a job or why you didn't get a job. One of the things that I've heard many times is, you got the job because of this, this, and this, and that's all great. And then usually at the end, they say, frankly, we also thought you could really help us advocate for this project with our funders, or you really could help us get this project approved with the city. And that comes to them saying that the way you present the work, the way you see the work, the way you're willing to talk about the work isn't just, oh, please fund my project, please fund this great building, but you see the relationship between advancing societal purposes and architecture.
And that's why we're citizen architects. So being an architect doesn't necessarily mean just building the building. It actually means, and Anne probably wants to talk more about that in a second, but in general, I mean, I think through the AIA, I've been able to, I went to the grassroots conference in Washington, DC. I've been doing a lot of work for women, for minorities. Now I'm looking into slave labor and other things. I just did a talk last week. So I just want everyone to know that we need to show up and have a place at the table. And because projects are not just about the building and they're about society, and architects are taught to think about many things, including the building. But a lot of them don't want to have a seat at the table. A lot of them don't want to sit at planning boards and want to do other things because they're really busy, but it's really important because our voice really matters. We're taught in a different way to see things visually and to see things in a different way than other fields. And if we don't show up, we can't complain. So that's why I'm on the Needham Planning Board. There were no architects or no planners on the planning board. And so it takes a lot of my time and a lot of work, but if we don't represent the architects and the planners, especially in committees that are about architects and planners, we're doing society a disservice. And so I feel passionate that everybody needs to find their passion and make an impact. And that's not something that's necessarily, maybe it is now being taught at the architecture school. So I'll let Anne talk about citizen architect, and she's also teaching this semester.
Well, thank you, but Laura has.
Oh, no, I'm a
people-
silent moderator.
But you
Y'all got it.
you had some questions that you were going to raise, Laura, and Natasha, thank you so much for this. You had some questions and maybe others do, so we can.
Sure, I mean, we had a couple of conversations kind of in planning this planning this discussion. So we talked about a few questions, but I feel like a lot of the threads have already been touched on through the presentation. So I have no need to go through some itemized list. But
there is a question behind you though.
Because I'm curious to hear you guys talk about how you codify your relationship contractually, because I think in terms of it's another place for advocacy, right, and communication. So did you work in a traditional, like, architect of record and design architect relationship? And if so, or joint venture? I mean, I think there's also like sort of liability issues. The reason I'm asking that question is I think there's probably a different model, an emerging model that has to happen that kind of recognizes new collaborative relationships.
You may want to repeat the question. I'm just going to get
Yeah.
some water.
yeah, Krista, if you guys couldn't hear the question, Krista, who I happen to know over here, was asking about how the relationship between the two firms in this project was solidified contractually, just trying to think about how there's needs to be new emerging models to support this type of practice and this way of setting up project teams.
So the traditional way is the architect of record and design architect. And when I was at Lears Weinzapfel, that's something that we did with Maki and with others. But I like the fact that we were always involved in the projects. It was more integrated. And so when I started my firm, I needed capacity, and then also I didn't have enough work just under my belt for a lot of the public projects that I was doing and for other projects. And I started collaborating with other firms. And one of the things that I learned is that AIA does not have contracts for anything other than joint ventures or that type of collaboration. And it made no sense to me that you couldn't collaborate in different ways to make the best team for the project. And so I have had to hire, I've had to create contracts and then go through my insurance company and through our attorneys to make sure that we're all covered for liability. But I didn't like working in that way. It felt like one firm did one thing and one firm did the other. I like a more integrated, but every project is different. And so one of the things that I can say is that DCAM and Massport have done a great job of trying to give visibility to minority and women-owned firms and small firms, the disadvantaged and veteran-owned. And they created this partnership. And Sasaki, we're doing a project with Sasaki that's in construction right now, was one of the first projects where they implemented it, so they hold accountability. Because what happens is that whoever's the prime architect ends up kind of dictating what happens on the projects. And so that the minority architect or the collaborating architect ends up not having as much of a say. And so I think that looking at it through the lens of every time we go for an interview, the other thing that we were doing is we're going for interviews as partnerships. And then once we got the project, then people would ignore us. That happened once, right? And so what the great thing with some of these institutions is that now they're holding accountability on that. And we want to have good partnerships. And I had visibility through the BSA. So people were very gracious with me, which is why when Anne approached me, I'm like, we'll do it together. I'd like to prime it, but we're going to be very respectful of each other.
But I think to your point, there is a checklist of who's doing what, prime and a review, prime and a review. And so in our case, we have more capacity because we're a bit bigger, had a longer run as a firm, hopefully many, many decades still to come as Annam. And I think the reason that partnering seems important to us is really intellectual capacity. It's certainly people capacity, but it's the enlargement of perspective, viewpoints, and expertise. And you can't do everything in a firm of 50. And when you meet another firm that has a different point of view or other skill set, you have to do what's best for the client, for the project. That's our commitment, right?
But I would say that this was not the norm until probably 5-10 years ago. I think it was much more like delineated.
Yeah.
And I think that, I don't know if it has to do with, being able to work remotely, being able to be nimble. Like we have laptops that are really powerful that we can go to anyone's office, or they can, we can take them anywhere. The nimble aspect, and COVID in some ways helped that also, because everybody expected you to be able to at least be on Zoom or be in a hybrid mode. So it allowed for everyone to be able to work together in a different way.
It's a whole nother seminar.
Well, it sounds like the way you guys have it set up, you have the mutual basis of respect right off the bat, but have you found firms have come to you and wanted to partner to get MBE, WBE box checking, and like, how do you kind of vet that?
Well, you've probably seen more of that than we have, but I don't know. It's really it is honestly a whole nother seminar.
They told me how to fix the screen. People on there can still hear us.
And
Okay.
I think I'm glad you brought it up, but we could spend the whole time on it. So what I'd say is, I think to have this conversation, you probably should have some owners who have experience partnering architects and can speak to it, like Massport, tell you what they see as the pros and cons of it. Some firms that are minority firms, ours is also, Annam is a minority-owned firm, that have been invited to the game, and what their value system is for when they say yes and when they don't say yes. Some emerging firms, because emerging firms are really looking for partnering, but it is very difficult to say you'll take an emerging firm on and then have a traditional relationship because they don't get a voice. It's like what you say. So I think it's, for me, it's a deeper conversation, but bottom line for me is if it's good, if the project needs more capacity or more diversity or more intellectual strength, bench strength, then the architect ought to be looking for who does it take to do that project.
I think partnering makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And we're used to it. So when we go in for projects, we're like, we've done this before and we've done it in 10, 15 different ways. And we've done it with very prominent firms and we've done it. So I think it's getting the clients to feel comfortable with understanding that they're not the guinea pigs and that this is a new trend.
Yeah.
That and everything, you see it in music, you see it in movies, you see everyone is collaborating. It's not just about a single voice anymore. And if you don't jump on that bandwagon, you're gonna basically not have any work because there is a value to have different firms with different expertise and also to give people, it's a wave of entrepreneurship in architecture. And I think that's really important because it's really hard to start a firm. And I was at a great firm and I was lucky to be at a great firm and I started the firm for different reasons, just to try a different model, try something different. But a lot of people don't know how to approach entrepreneurship. And if the larger firms take up all the work and don't give opportunities to other people that are talented, that have different voices, we're doing a disservice to the profession.
Sorry, I
we
had to
have
run out and run back in.
questions? No.
Yeah,
I wanted to just
How about
touch on
anybody
a
else
couple
here?
of,
Yeah.
couple of the points that we kind of glossed over, maybe from our outline, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to touch on was consensus. That kind of sounded like it came up a lot, how to build consensus with the different community groups and with the regulatory agencies. And it sounds like that initial credibility through research and through just your firms helped a lot. But you also walked into a discordant environment. There's already conflict there.
Yeah.
So kind of how did you start that process and how do you see it moving as you move into construction? What new battles do you think will come up?
Well, there are several questions there. I think walking into uneasy situations is very typical in practice. There's almost always been stuff before. There's always people who, and sometimes they look at the architect as somebody who's going to bring them all together. So, the moving parts, the chessboard is always there. And I think asking for advice is very important. So you meet a new client or you have a new client. And I would say, well, you design the building, but you're also designing the communication process. So what's it like to design a communication process? That's not what we think is part of the design process, but it's absolutely critical. And if you don't plan out how the sequence of communications will be, who you'll be communicating with, how to listen to them, what their major concerns are, and how you're going to focus on the things we can agree on, as opposed to the things we can't agree on, then it's harder. So my mind goes to that kind of orderly process. And I think asking for help is very important. I think we couldn't have figured out who to talk to for the South End without asking EVA all of their thoughts. And I think that, frankly, there's very challenging to get a modern building approved in the historic district, and literally asking the staff of the BPDA of Boston Landmarks for their help, rather than just saying, we want to come in. What do you think we should do? How do you think we should approach this? We want to work with you. Can you advise us? Let us bring you into our studio process. What do you think of our direction? We had numerous staff meetings with them before we went to the commission. And as a result, we first of all learned a lot. And secondly, we had heard what some of the major concerns would be. And there still were many, many concerns, but we had some preparation and some good advice
And strategy.
and some strategic thinking.
And I would say Anne was really critical and with landmarks for strategy. But I also think that, you know, I mean, I started my firm 10 years ago, but I have 30 years of experience. So, and both of us have sat on both sides of the table.
Yes,
So-
I've been on the commission for 7 years, a different commission.
Right.
But I've been on it for 7 years. I was afraid to go to the supermarket. I thought people were gonna, scream at me over the meat counter because, you're always saying no to people or you're saying yes, but, and it's very rare to go in and say yes all the way. So, I'd been in that position and those are volunteers. Those are people who are spending 5-6 hours a night as volunteers. I mean,
But it gives you a perspective. So I think going into it, I think that's the biggest thing is that you go into it understanding the perspective of the regulatory group. And the perspective of the client, the perspective of the architect, right? So that's why everybody has to kind of touch all different parts of the process or, I think it's harder to be successful when you're not exposed to all of it.
Yeah.
And so even the young architects and the interns and everyone show up at these meetings, listen to how these meetings go out, understand how you present things. I mean, I learned from Anne. I hope Anne learned from me also. We were a good team presenting. And she taught me a lot about strategy that, in a different way than I had.
but it's not, I want to distinguish this from political strategy. It's not some kind of strategic
No.
game plan. But I think,
It's how to present your project so that
Yeah.
many people understand
Yeah.
it and understand the client's point of view
I
and the
think
city's point
I
of view.
think of it more as engagement than strategy.
Maybe,
I-
maybe engagement is a better word.
I just think that the engagement of people, people want to see good things happen. The question is, under what conditions is something judged to be a good thing?
But we want to make sure, when I say strategy is, we
You
want it to
mean
be concise.
gamesmanship, You mean,
Yeah,
like
I don't mean
just-
strategy that we're trying to, it's more of, we want to show the specific group what they're, we want to listen to what they're saying and present it in a way that we come to a consensus of how to go about it, rather than just trying to do what we want to do, or just doing what they want to do, which we may not think is the best thing for the project. So how do you represent the design and the conversation that you've had with these groups in a way that is advantageous to everyone to be able to move the process in a positive way?
touching on that too, I hear like the veins of you were on the commission, you've been involved, so you understand the stakeholders. It's another way that the distinction between practice and advocacy is a false one, I think. I'm curious what your thoughts are about, this, people have this distinction of like practice and advocacy and how those two actually are much more integral and feed one another. Even with regard to professional advancement and, getting involved in your local community, these types of things.
Well, say the question.
Yeah, I don't understand.
I'm thinking,
Heading to the why.
I'm thinking about, just the fact that the professional advancement is tied to your contributions and your engagement with the broader community.
Right.
Like that you can't really practice in a vacuum, but you are naturally have to find ways that you engage with the community.
Well, not only the community, but just your profession.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think you need to find your passion. I mean, Anne was talking about at MIT, she was talking about historic buildings and repurposing them and all of that, I mean, I found my passion in advocacy through equity recently. I would say recently, because I've always championed for women, but recently in the past 5 years, even in my community, the reason they put me on this Needham United Against Racism is because I showed up to the meeting when the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, right during that movement, they had a meeting to hear in town, an 87% Caucasian town, why, if people felt that way. And I remember writing, I remember saying, I need to come to this meeting. I had been sitting on the Permanent Public Building Committee for many years, so I knew. But I said, if I don't speak up, there's only, not many of us. If I don't speak up, I'll be doing a disservice to my community.
Mhm.
So I actually wrote something that was very passionate about how I felt about it. And I remember telling my father about it, reading it to him before I said it. And he's like, you better be careful because people, as Anne said, may get angry by what you have to say. And I said, I'm willing to take the risk.
Mhm.
And so, because I have respect from some people in the community and they know that I'm doing it to move the community in a positive way. And because of it, they made me part of the board of that particular thing. And then they wanted me to be on the planning board so I could advocate for affordable housing and equity and all of that. So I think that you find your passion, whatever it is, if it's the environment, if it's children, if it's, and you find a way of making a difference. And if you find that passion and you find the avenue to make impact, people will look for you to continue to move that forward. And so, I don't know, man, if you,
Um, I'm not an advocate for everything. And I think I'm becoming more selective in my choices of what I can spend my time on. But when you see something like EVA, come on, how can you not? How can you not? And so the good news is Boston's a very engaged city. I mean, participation here is blood sport at times. People love to get in a community meeting and talk and talk and talk and talk. So, you know, it can be exhausting. And I think you just have to select something you think is important to you and that you feel you can contribute to. And I think particularly the idea of filling a gap. There are a lot of issues in the city that do need the architect's voice. So I was mentioning to you, Laura, before we got started, that I went to the AIA website. Let's look at that for a minute. So if you go to the AIA website, you know, nearly everybody here probably either is a member of the AIA or going to be a member of the AIA, or you're associate AIA, you all know that the BSA is part of it. So all you have to do when you go to the AIA website is put in the query under their search button, advocacy, and about 16 things show up. And they're all either committees or groups or important issues that architects have started to talk about. And they're called knowledge communities. I like that name a lot, that it's not just about opinion makers. It's about knowledge, that we have knowledge that not everybody has. And we don't have all the knowledge, but we have enough to contribute to some discussions that are very critical to our country and globally. And the AIA has invited every age group to join these groups. And they're virtual, a lot of them. But when I went to AIA Chicago this year, I went out to the convention. Everybody was meeting constantly about these issues. They were all in breakout groups, people from all over the country, all ages. And I think that's a very strong statement about our profession, that people would be seeking opportunities to discuss what housing issues there are in Texas, what housing issues there are in Idaho, how that relates to housing issues in Washington. It's a global perspective when you belong to the AIA. In the BSA, that AIA has all these different things: federal policy, state and local issues, leadership education, alliance organizations. Just, you know, get your glass of something at the end of the day and go through it. And you go like, I had no idea the AIA did all this. I thought and you can fill in the blank about what you thought about the AIA, but I thought it just did this. And you suddenly realize this is your platform to engage with people who are trained in similar ways, but they're different people than you and are thinking about issues in their communities that are maybe different than yours, but there's going to be common ground. And that's, I think, a big opportunity. And by the same token, the BSA, if you query advocacy there, you get all kinds of stuff. And I'm very impressed with what the BSA is doing about its future planning. I'm very interested in the BSA Foundation and its message and clarifying its message. And I think that the profession is doing some important work, laying groundwork for all of us, even right out of school or in school, to be engaged in these things. I don't think you have to wait to be my age. If you do, you will have wasted 40 years not being engaged. You don't want to wait. You want to do it now because it's going to help you figure out the things you do care about. I don't care about all the things that I used to care about quite as much. There's some new things that I didn't even know existed when I started to practice that I care very much about, and I'm still learning. And I think the advantage of AIA and BSA is that they're learning communities. That's why they call them knowledge communities. They don't know everything, but they're not about just talking. They're about learning. And I think that's an essential piece of architecture that makes our profession special. We continue to learn constantly. And I think that's a gift. You know, it's a gift to be curious. Like, to admit at age 72, I know nothing. I know nothing about sustainability. I fill out these forms and I go like, what is this stuff? And it's you all who teach me about it, but also organizations. I do know something about it. But, you know, you take the premise of, you know, of that, you go like, well, you know, in terms of what was taught at MIT in the 70s, forget about it. There was nothing taught really about it. Climate and environment was certainly a course, but not in this way that is so fundamental to our future. So anyway, that's a big change.
Yeah.
It's a big change and a critical part of learning, ongoing learning. You can't be an effective professional without being open to and constantly forcing yourself to learn.
Finding
what-
Being
finding new
curious.
passions you have that you didn't know existed.
That's right.
And being curious.
Being curious, endlessly curious.
Well, that was the last question I had was what advice do you have for young professionals who might think they have to serve their time and wait before they can make a meaningful impact?
Well, first of
So
all,
I think you hit it on the
Don't
head.
think somebody else is going to do it because you're
Yeah.
going to do it. But one of the interesting parts of it, you know, just from a very selfish point of view, is that the knowledge you gain from this ongoing learning informs your practice.
Yeah.
It makes you a better colleague and a more valued one. And of course, you're going to have other sessions about advocating for yourself in your firm. And it's, I think, a lot easier to advocate for yourself if you bring something to the table that the practice really values. And so this ongoing education is part of that.
But I think anyone can make an impact, especially now in the information age. Anyone can make an impact at any moment. It's just up to them. And I'd like to highlight, so Jaime Hiley, who's with our office, who came today, was the president of the NOMAS chapter at Wentworth. She and the co-chair, Andres Jimenez, both worked for our office. Andres just went back to start his master's. And I do have to say that they're in charge of it's the National Organization of Minority Architects, the student group for Wentworth. They made so much impact in the work that they did that we just had a meeting. We're doing a project with Wentworth. We had a meeting and the VPs that were with us were like, hi, me, outright. When we went to the meeting, they knew her. And so I think if you find something that you want to push forward, again, finding a passion, finding something that you're interested in, finding something you're curious about. There are so many opportunities. And I have to say the BSA is a great place to start because you can be a leader at one of, you know, if there's an opening at one of the knowledge communities, you could be a leader through Women in Design. You could be a leader through NOMA, Boss NOMA. You could be a leader in many different ways. They're so open to letting you find your passion and push it forward and super supportive. And in some ways it feels like it's really kind of two-layered maybe, but that's the best thing about the BSA, that it actually allows you to find your passion and there will be support.
Yeah.
And if you do a good job, they will call you every week
They'll put
to
you on
do something
everything.
else. And so it gives you, you know, again, it gives you opportunities for things that you never thought you would be involved in.
Yeah.
Because if you show interest in something, people will notice. And it's not too early to start.
I promised I'd let the people that are joining virtually have an opportunity if there's any questions, and we have just a couple of minutes left. I'm sorry. Was there any questions both in the room or virtually that you were hoping to hit? Feel free to unmute
It looks
yourself.
like there's a hand.
Oh. No, I think that's.
Oh, no, that's yours.
Okay.
I have one more question. Have you noticed during COVID that, the community is more engaged?
Yeah.
And, or the
Yeah.
architecture profession more, into
Yeah.
advocacy, because
Yeah.
it creates, I feel like COVID sometimes focuses people's energies.
Yeah.
But also, especially with the virtual environment, the community members can more easily, participate in. The
I'm so
process.
glad you mentioned that, because in one of the BPDA, in order to work for Eva and to work for Natasha, I started to listen into that's a joke. I started to listen into BPDA meetings. And they go really long, you know, and then your husband's going like, is dinner, and what with dinner, is dinner happening? And you go, no, I'm listening to a BPDA meeting.
Yeah.
But he likes to listen to them too. I mean, you know, it's not a lot going on in our house. So, there was someone, to your point, who spoke up and was a person with disabilities and said that she, and I really love this. She said, I can be part of this group because of the Zoom. And she said, I don't want you to stop. I thought that was solid gold. I need you to continue this platform so that I can participate. So I would say, yes, I do find more engagement. I think people are hungrier for it. And maybe it's just because we all feel the rug was pulled out from under us. And you know, what our community was so dissolved for some period of time. Everyone has their own personal experiences on this. But I've found there's a lot more POW in the meetings going on. Yeah, more people. What do you think?
I agree. I was on a project that started pre-COVID and went through COVID. And I noticed that the barrier to entry for the community members to participate was leveled a lot
Yeah.
because of that. Literally for the people who are, who have physical impairments, but also for anybody who is kind of interested, but didn't want to have to
Yeah.
go to town hall
Yeah,
or anything, but
yeah.
that way they can tune in kind of quietly and be a fly on the wall and see what the process is.
There's more
And
accessibility.
sometimes not a fly on the wall. Because
Yeah.
after a few of those, you get into it, you know, and you sort of like, well, this is my meeting too. You know, I agree with you. I think it's been a wonderful breakthrough for that. I'm glad you mentioned it.
And
Yeah,
it
so
was,
hopefully it stays.
it was also fascinating how quickly the BPDA got a language plan in place. Once they realized that there was no ability to translate for different projects, now they have simultaneous translation on those virtual meetings.
And Eva has her own translation. As we were speaking, it was being, and I actually, one thing that we didn't mention is that when we did the community meetings, I did them in Spanish and Anne did them and Anne spoke in English. And then they translated each one of us. But we thought that that was important. And I have to tell you, it was really scary for me because it was the first time that I had talked about architecture, which has its own language in Spanish, because it's my first language, but I don't speak to people.
I thought you were
my-
pretty convincing
I
for where I stood.
I actually, they told me that it sounded, I mean, I had to write down, and Danielle, who's here, was helping me with some words, because there are some words that you just don't say on a regular basis. And that it's kind of the architecture lingo that, you know, if I was taught in English and, you know, so it was really interesting for me and a growth experience for me. And then I had the frightening moment of having to do a lecture to architects in Puerto Rico in Spanish also. And so I had to really think about it, about how do I, and I think Beatriz is here. I think it went okay. And you know, I was so proud to be able to do it, not only here in Spanish to the Puerto Rican community, but actually to Puerto Rico. And then the frightening part was to architects who, but it was, as Anne would say, you continue to grow. It's like layers of growth that you don't know are happening, that each project gives you an opportunity to have another layer. And I'm really thankful for that in general.
Laura, thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to end with gratitude. Thank you for joining virtually. I know we had some folks dropping off, but we appreciate y'all joining and
Thank
have
you.
a good night.